What's up everybody, welcome back. In today's video we're going to set up some widgets for our inventory system so we can actually see what's going on. So for this episode we're going to focus on the player side of the inventory, and we're also going to make sure that if we have a HUD in our game that it will be integrated with the inventory system and they will not mess each other up. So that's today's episode. If you like the channel and the series, please consider leaving a like. It helps the channel out tremendously. And if you want to support the channel, you can take a look at the Ko-fi page or take a look at becoming a member on YouTube. And both of you will give you access to the premium channels in the Discord, where you will also find a few exclusive downloads for supporters. So with that information out of the way, let's dive into the video. So first of all, I want to take a quick look at setting up a HUD. So a few of you might have one in your game project, and if not, you might want to add one at some point. So it's probably a good idea to have this integrated from the start. So I've created a simple HUD. I only have a few keybinds on here, so there's actually something to see. And I'm only going to add a hint on top of here for the clients if we are testing in Pi that they need to select a save slot before they do anything. So I'm going to drag in a border in here and anchor it to the top center. And then I'm going to grab some text and drop that inside of the border. So this is going to be my border save slot text. And make sure that this is a variable. And then we also want to rename the actual text and turn that into a variable as well. So this is going to be the text save slot hint. And that's a variable. So for the border, we want to make sure that by default it's hidden. So set it to hidden. Then I'm going to set it to size to content and anchor it for the X to 0. And then for Y something like 30. And then the size should be fine. Set the alignment to 0.5 to center it out. And make sure that we give it a nice color that fits our project. So let's bump down the alpha a bit. And I'm going to save this color as well for later. So then I'm going to grab the text over here. And turn this into a red text. So I'm simply going to say select your save slot using the number keys 1, 2, 3. So select your save slot using the number keys 1, 2, 3. So we're only going to display this for the clients. So let's make sure that if we go to our graph that we set up some stuff for this. So first of all, in event construct, we're going to grab a branch. And we want to check if we are the server, so is server. And if we are not the server, then we're going to show the border. So let's grab in the border and set the visibility and make sure it's visible if we are not the server. And then I'm going to grab, let's create a function for that, by the way. That's a little bit easier because we need it later as well. So let's make a function, call it set save slot visibility. And then in here, we're going to grab a branch and we're going to use an input. So let's create a new input, call this new visibility. Hook it up to a branch, and then we can simply set it accordingly. So the true one should be visible, and we can grab a second one of these and set it to hidden. Hook it up here and plug in the save slot. So that should be good to go. Then for the event graph, we can simply call this function set save slot visibility and make it visible. And then we're also going to create a function set save slot text. And for this one, oh, that's a graph. That's nice. So set save slot text. And for this one, we need the text save slot. So we're going to drag that in and we're going to set the text. So we can drag the text on top of the input node to create that variable. And for the text, we want to be the actual slot number of our save slot. So let's call this the slot number. And let's grab a format text node to make it look a little bit better. So I'm going to say save slot open bracket A close bracket, and then plug this in here. And that should be good to go. We could change the color because now it's red, so maybe drag off here and do set color and opacity. Plug it in, and then we're going to make a slate color and select our green color. So this is text, so we probably want to bump up the alpha so it stands out from the border, and that should be good. Now if we go to our third person controller, we want to make sure that we have this integrated as well. So I'm going to create a function first and call this UI show Ingame HUD. So this is going to be pretty basic. We're simply going to create the HUD widget. So create widget. And we want to create our in-game HUD. Then we can promote it to a variable. So that's our in-game HUD. And then we want to make sure that we grab an isValid node at the beginning here. Plug it in. So if it's not valid, we're going to create it. And if it's already valid, then all we need to do is add it to the viewport. So what was that? Okay. So add to viewport. Plug it in, and that should be good to go. Then in the event graph, we want to call this on begin play. So let's go to our begin play event, and over here we have a check for the local controller. So if we are locally controlled, we want to set up our HUD. So let's make a little bit of room in here and call our UI show in-game HUD. So that's good to go. And then for the clients over here, if they have a save slot selected, I'm not going to use these prints anymore, but I'm going to call the set save slot text on my in-game HUD. So I can simply drag it in and say set save slot text. Plug it in and fill in the correct number. So we have that good to go. So again, to make sure this save slot selection is only needed to properly test in the editor. So if you're actually building a game and every player has its own local save game, you don't need to add this. So in the final build of the game, you're probably going to delete this, but it makes testing a whole lot easier. So that's why we're adding it. So we have our HUD set up, and now we can start working on the inventory. So I have created a bunch of HUD icons for the StackObot assets, and I'll make sure to drop a link in the description so you can download those if you don't feel like creating them yourself. So first of all, let's open up our pickup item data table and make sure that we add the HUD icons for the items that we have set up. So for the orb, let's add the correct icon, and then we have a fan over here. And the last one is our dish. So that's good to go. We can't forget those anymore. Now let's dive into our widgets folder. And the first thing I want to create is an empty widget called Player Inventory. So let's just create a new widget, user widget, and that's my Player Inventory. So we're going to keep this for later, but we need a reference to it. So that's why we already created. So the next one we're going to create is another widget, user interface, widget blueprint, user widget, and then we're going to create the inventory slot. So widget blueprint, inventory slot. Okay. And let's set this one up first. So let's add a size box in here first. Grab a size box, drop it onto the widget, and we're going to select it and set the width and the height override, both make it 100 units. Then we're going to grab ourselves a border and drop it in here. This is going to be the border for the background. So let's rename it border background and make sure that it's a variable. And then I'm simply going to select my brush color. So set it to the border color, and that's good to go. Then we're going to grab another border and drop it on top of that one, and this is going to be the border inventory icon. So let's name this one as well, inventory icon, and that's also a variable. And for this border we don't really need to set anything, so that's good to go. And then the last thing we want to add is some text on top of the last border, and this is going to be for the item amount. So let's call this text item amount, and that's also a variable. So I'm just going to set this to 0 for now and make it green. There we go, and change the font. Then I want to make sure it's aligned to the bottom right, so I'm going to set it to align right and then bottom, and that should be good to go as well. For this one we need to add a few things in the graph, so let's open that one up as well. First of all, we're going to add a few variables. So the first one is the item row name. So that's a name variable, and we want to make sure that we set this to instance editable and exposed on spawn. And then we also need the item amount, and that's an integer. So item amount integer, and we need a boolean that tells us if it's a world item or a player item. So is world item, and make it a boolean. And the last thing we need is a reference to our player inventory widget. So we're going to create that one as well. Widget blueprint player inventory. And that needs to be of our widget blueprint player inventory. So that's why we created it already. And for that one, you want to set it to instance editable and exposed on spawn as well. And by the way, we also want to do it for the world item and for the item amount. So just for all 4 of those variables, instance editable and exposed on spawn. Then let's set up our event construct in here. So let's get rid of the other ones. First, we're going to look for a table row. So get a table row. And we want to get it from our pickup info. So we're going to plug in our item row name and break the result over here. So we can set up our inventory slot. So first let's set the background. We're going to grab in our border inventory icon and then set the brush from texture. Plug it in, and we can grab the texture from our data table. So that's the HUD icon, and that should be good. Then we're going to grab a branch in here, and we want to make sure that our item amount is greater than 1. So let's drag off here, greater than. Make sure it's actually 1. There we go. So if it's greater than 1, we want to show the number, and if it's smaller than 1, we can just hide it. So we're going to grab our text item amount and set the visibility. So if this is false, we want to hide it. And let's make it visible again if this is greater than 1. So visible, plug it in here. And if it's visible, we also want to make sure that we set it to the correct amount. So let's drag off here again and set the text. And then we can simply plug in our item amount variable over here. Nope. And it will convert it for us. So I'm going to open this up and disable grouping, although there probably won't be 1,000 items in here, so it's not really needed. But so that's set up. Then we're going to create a custom event in here as well. And we're going to call that update item amount. And for this, we're going to simply drag in our item amount setter and hook it up. Make sure that we plug it in so we get a variable for it or an input. And then we can simply hook this up to the branch over here. So if we want to change our item amount, we can set it first and then just call this part, and that should be good as well. So this is our inventory slot for now. Let's set up our next widget. So let's close this one down. And this one is going to be really simple. So we're going to create a third widget, and this is going to be our inventory grid. So again, a user widget, widget blueprint, inventory grid. Open it up, and the only thing we want to add in here is a uniform grid panel. So let's drop it right on top of here and make sure that we rename it. So I'm going to rename this the inventory grid and turn it into a variable. And that's all we need to do in here. The reason I'm using a widget for this and not simply drag this uniform grid panel into my inventory is because this is more useful if we add our drag and drop system later. So right now this might seem a little bit useless, but in the end this will be needed. So with this setup we can go into our player inventory and start setting that one up. So first of all, let's grab a canvas panel and drop it right on top of here. Then we are going to need some sort of a title. So let's grab a border in here. And for the anchors, I'm going to use this top bar. And then for the offset left, it's going to be 0. Position Y is going to be 50. Offset right 0. And size Y is going to be 105. Then assign the correct color and drop some text on top of this. So this is simply my inventory. And then let's align it to the center and do that vertically as well. Assign the correct font. And we're going to increase this a little bit, so 56 maybe. And let's make it green as well. So I'm just going to save this color. Oh, really? There we go. Okay, that's our title screen, and then we want to set up the borders. So let's grab a border, drop it on top of here. Inside this border we're going to create our player inventory. So first let's grab a vertical box and drop that inside of this one. And then inside the vertical box we want to drop some text. And after the text we're going to go to our user created section and we're going to grab our inventory grid and drop that inside the vertical box as well. So let's select the first border first and let's set it up. So I'm going to anchor it to the center of the screen. And then let me grab my notes quickly so I can peek. So I'm going to set this to -800 and then -300 on the Y. Size is going to be 700 by 700 and that should be good to go. So change the color over here. And there we have our border. So for the text over here, I'm simply going to say player inventory. Turn it into my green text and assign the proper font. Maybe shrink it down a little bit. That should be good as well. Now you want to select your player inventory grid and we're going to rename this. So I'm going to name this the grid inventory player. It's a variable, that's good. And for the alignment, we want to make sure that we set it to align left and align top. So it's actually all the way shrunken down and it will size to the content that we put inside it. So this should be our player inventory and we can set up some of the event graph in this as well. So let's do that next. So for now we're only going to add one function, so let's go to the graph and let's create it. We're going to call this a setup inventory grid. And let's give it some inputs. So the first one we need is the actual contents. And that's an array of our inventory contents. So we have a structure for that, inventory contents, and let's turn it into an array. And then we need two booleans. So we're going to call the first one a player inventory and turn it into a single bool, not a byte. And the second is going to be the world inventory and that's also a boolean. So let's grab a branch in here and check if we want to set up the player inventory or not. And then we need local variables. So I'm going to create two of those. The first one is the local inventory slot widgets. Inventory slot widgets. And that's actually an array of our widget blueprint inventory slots. So let's look for the inventory slot widget blueprint. So not the grid, but the slot. And we want to turn this into an array. And then we also need a local inventory grid. So local inventory grid. And that's actually our inventory grid widget. And that's not an array, but a single one. So that's good to go. The reason I'm using local variables is because we're going to use this function to update the world inventory as well later. So we can simply replace the local variables and do not have to write all of the other code again. So right now, again, it seems useless, but later in the series, this will save us time. So I'm going to drag in my local inventory slot widgets as a setter, plug it in. And we also need to create the actual array that we're going to set this to. So let's create another variable and call this all inventory slots player. And this is not a local variable, but a normal one. So inventory slots player. And that's an array of our inventory slots. So let's look for inventory slot again and turn this into an array as well. So we want to set the local inventory slots to the player inventory slots. And then we want to set the local inventory grid to our player inventory grid. So that's the grid we actually added in the designer, and that's available as a variable as well. Once we have that set up, we're going to grab a for each loop. And instead of looping through our inventory slots player, we can now loop through the local array. So if we change the array later into the world item array, we do not have to redo all of the code behind here. So we're going to simply remove all of these from parent, in case there are any old ones left in here. And then we're going to grab the local inventory array and we're going to clear it. So we're going to start clean. Once that's done, we're going to grab another for each loop and we want to plug in our contents from the input pin over here. So we can simply right click and look for get contents, and that will actually pop up as a variable, although we didn't create it as a local variable. So we can simply plug it into the for each loop and that works. So we want to break our array element here. And then we want to create our inventory slot widgets. So let's drag off the loop body and create a widget. Select our widget blueprint inventory slot. And then we can plug in the row name over here and the item amount as well. So this is not a world item because we are updating the player inventory. So we can simply leave this to false. And for the player inventory widget, that's a reference to ourselves. And then for the owning controller or the owning player, we can get our owning player and simply plug it in, and that's good to go as well. Then we want to add this to the array of inventory slots. So we're going to grab our local inventory slot widgets and we're simply going to add and plug it in, and that should be good. Then we want to place it inside of our uniform grid panel. So we're going to grab our local inventory grid, but this is the actual widget. So first we need to get the variable for the grid panel. So that's the get inventory grid. And then with this one, we can add a slot to uniform grid. So add to uniform grid, plug it in here. And the content that we want to add comes from the create widget node. So that's the return value over here. And for the row and the column, we can grab the index over here. For the row, we want to divide it through 7. So divide through 7 and simply plug it in here. And for the column, we want to use the modulo. So if we drag off here and do %, so that's modulo, and do modulo 7, that will give us the correct column. So this will divide the index through 7, and the remainder of that division will be the outcome of this. So if we have 8, for example, we divide it through 7, so we leave 1, so it will go in the second row and then in the first column. So that's how we can use this. So that should be good to go, and then we want to check at the end of this for each loop. So grab a branch, the for each loop for the contents, plug this in here, and we want to double check if this is our player inventory or our world inventory. So we can get it from here. Simply do get player inventory, and then we can plug it in. So if this is our player inventory, we need to make sure that we store the local array in the player array again. So we're going to drag in the all inventory slots player as a setter and plug in the local inventory slots. So we store everything back in the player's array. And that's all we need to do. So then we can grab a return node and we are done for this function. So let's compile and save this one. And let's set up everything in the character and the controller so this will actually work. So first of all, let's take care of the player controller. So open up the third person controller. And in here we're going to create a function to show the inventory screen. So first we can simply duplicate the show Ingame HUD one. And we're going to name this show player inventory or show inventory menu. That's probably a little bit more accurate. So show inventory menu. Let's get rid of the references to our HUD in here. Hello, thank you. And I want to create the player inventory widget this time. So this one, and then we can promote it to a variable again. So this is our widget blueprint player inventory. And hook it back up. So also plug it into the add to viewport and grab one for the is valid node at the beginning. Then we need a little bit more room because we want to do a few more other things in here. So first of all, I want to set the show mouse cursor and the input mode. So let's drag off here, set show mouse cursor. And we want to show it. So let's enable it. And then we want to set the input mode to game and UI. So for the player controller, we can grab ourselves as a reference. For the widget to focus, I'm going to plug in the player inventory. And I'm going to deselect hide cursor during capture. And that should be good as well. Let's see, then we want to grab our player inventory. And we need our third person character for that. So let's drag our third person character reference in. And let's get our inventory. And we also want to grab our widget. So the widget blueprint player inventory, and from the widget we're gonna call the update inventory grid. Player inventory. So did I misspell it? Oh, setup inventory grid. Okay, that's my bad. So let's call the function we just created, setup inventory grid. We can plug in the player inventory into the contents, and let's enable the player inventory boolean because that's the one we want to update. That's good to go as well. The last thing we want to do is check if we have a HUD on screen, and if we do, we're gonna hide it. So let's grab in our in-game HUD, and first of all let's check if it's valid. Plug it in here. If it's valid, we also want to know if it's actually in the viewport. So let's drag off again and is in viewport. So let's grab a branch for the second one and plug it into the valid pin. Plug this one into the condition. So if that's true as well, we're gonna set the visibility to hidden. So simply drag off the HUD, set visibility. Oh really? Visibility, there we go, and we're gonna hide it. So this is for the true pin, and if both of those are false, we don't need to do anything. So let's return, and that's good to go. There we go. Then let's go into our event graph because we also want to create an event if we leave the menu. So let's look for an empty spot over here and call this a custom event leave inventory menu. So this doesn't need to replicate. We're going to call this from the local client, and this needs to run locally as well, so that's good. First, we're going to drag in our player inventory reference and just get rid of it. So we're going to clear it. Then we want to remove the mouse cursor. So set show mouse cursor, and we want to hide it and set our input mode back to game. So set input mode game only. Player controller is a reference to ourselves again. And then we want to get our HUD back on screen. So let's drag in our in-game HUD, and we want to check if it's valid again. So if it's valid, then we can simply set the visibility, because we probably set that to hidden. So set visibility. Plug this in and set it to visible, and if it's not valid, we can simply call the show in-game HUD function to create a new one. And that should be all. So compile and save it. And now we can go into our project settings and set up a keybind. So let's go to edit project settings, and we want to go to the input tab and create a new action mapping. So I'm going to call this toggle inventory, and I'm going to use the Q key, but whatever you prefer, obviously. I'm not using tab because it doesn't fit into my little HUD widget, so that's the main reason. Okay, so that's good to go. We need to set up some stuff in the character, and then we are pretty much ready to test it. So with the action mapping in place, let's open our third person character, and we want to create the input event. So let's go to the event graph, and we're going to look for our toggle inventory event. So we're going to grab a reference to our player controller, and from there we want to get our widget blueprint player inventory. So get player inventory, the widget blueprint. So for this we want to know if it's valid, so drag off here is valid, plug it into the pressed pin. If it's valid, we're gonna remove it. So let's grab this bunch again, paste it over here, drag off the actual inventory and do remove from parent. And after that we want to call our leave inventory menu function. So we're gonna drag off the controller this time and not the inventory, and we're gonna call leave inventory menu and plug that in as well. And if it's not valid, we can simply call our create inventory menu. So drag off the controller again and call UI show inventory menu. Plug this one into the not valid pin, and that's already good to go. So now we have the local site set up. If we press the local input, it's going to open the menu, and when we open the menu, it will call the setup inventory grid on the widget, and that will update the actual grid. Now if we are on the player and we are adding or removing an item, we're actually on the server side, because we made sure that our interface only is executed by the server. So the only thing we need now is a replicated event from the server to tell us to update our HUD after we removed or added an item. So we're going to go back into our third person controller for the last time, and we're going to go into the event graph, and in there we're going to create a HUD update inventory grid. So that's a custom event, HUD update inventory grid. And we're going to give this a few inputs. The first one are the actual contents. So that's a content array again. So contents and our inventory contents array. And we're going to use two booleans for the player and the world inventory. So player inventory, and that's a single boolean. And use one for the world inventory as well. So that's good. Then we're going to drag in our player inventory widget, and we want to know if this is valid or not. So if we do not have the widget on screen, there's no need to update it. So we're not going to bother with it. So we also want to make sure that it's actually in the viewport. So drag off again, is in viewport. Hook this up to a branch and hook that up to the isValid pin. So if both of those are true, then we're going to update our inventory grid, and we can simply do that by grabbing our player inventory widget and call the setup inventory grid event or function. Plug this in here, and we can pass on the variables to make everything work. So for this event, we want to set it to replicate run on owning client, and that way the server can call this to tell us to update our HUD. So with this event in place, we can go back to the third person character for the last time. And let me grab my notes so I'm not screwing up. And for the add item to inventory, we want to go to the first for each loop, and at the end we're saving our player inventory. So we're simply going to update the HUD from here, drag in our player controller and call our HUD update inventory grid. Plug it in here. So we are the actual player, so we have the actual inventory as a variable we can plug in, and we can simply set the player inventory manually by enabling the bool. So we can copy this stuff and go to the remove item from inventory function, and we want to go to the for each loop again. So right before the return node, we're going to paste the same stuff. We're going to update our widget. So that should be good. Now we are ready to test, so I'm going to launch a multiplayer game and see if this is working. So before we test, I'm going to make sure that I'm clearing my save game. So let's show in Explorer. And over here we have the project folder. Let's go to saved and then save games, and I'm going to delete all of this. So that should be good. Now let's launch it in a 2-player listen server setting and see what happens. So we have the hint on our HUD that tells us to select a save slot. So let's select one for the client, and the text actually changes. So we have save slot 1 selected. Now let's open my inventory screen, and that's also working. And if I press it again, it's closing, so that's fine. Now let's pick something up. So we have 2 orbs picked up, as you saw in the top left of the screen. And if I open my inventory screen, it actually has 2 orbs in here. So I should be able to save and load, and they should still be there. But for now, I'm going to go to the server first, and that actually works as well. So then I'm going to pick up 2 orbs and 2 dishes, and let me open it up, and I'm going to drop 2 items over here. And you will see it actually live updates, so that's working as well. So now we have the server with 2 dishes in the inventory, and we have a client with 2 orbs in the inventory. So let's close it down and let's load it up again. So now we need to make sure that we select the same save slot, otherwise we do not get the correct inventory for the player, for the client. So if I select number 2 or 3, it will show an empty inventory, obviously. So I'm going to select number 1, and let's have a look. So we have 2 orbs in our inventory, and I should be able to drop them, and that's working just fine. So you can see the orbs dropped by the server are still in position as well. And if we go to the server side, we have 2 dishes in our inventory. So everything seems to be working. We can pick up, drop, everything will update on our HUD widget, and everything saves as it used to before. So that's pretty good. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please consider leaving a like, and I'll be back soon for more. Talk to you later, guys. Bye bye.